Welcome, everybody. We have John Danaher here, and he's a PhD from the University of Cork in Ireland and is currently a lecturer in law at NUI Galway in Ireland. And his research interests are quite eclectic, ranging from broadly from philosophy of religion to legal theory, with particular interests in human enhancement and neuroethics. We're going to be talking about algocracy today, which is quite a provoking term with the ocracy at the end there. Although I don't think it's meant to sound negative per se. It might inspire a form of an initial knee-jerk negative reaction to the idea. However, your paper on the subject is quite, it does take a bit of a negative stance to the idea of
Mm.
algocracy, which is, for those who haven't actually looked it up yet, rule by algorithm, especially as it pertains to politics and law, sort of. I'll let John describe what a algocracy is or how he defines it.
Yeah, sure. So thanks as well for inviting me back on the. I don't know if you call it a show. Do you call it a show? The
Yeah,
the
so
Adam Ford
it's
Hour.
a videographic meandering through cyberspace and beyond.
Okay, very good. Yeah, algocracy, as you picked up on, is just a variation on the kind of classic terminology of bureaucracy and democracy. So, rule by something or other. So, democracy is ruled by people, bureaucracy ruled by bureaucrats, technocracy ruled by technocrats, and algocracy ruled by algorithm. Now, I originally took the term from the work of a sociologist, a guy called Aneesh. I don't know what his first name is. That's the way he represents himself professionally, who used it to draw a contrast between different kinds of governance system that apply to human life. So a governance system here is understood as anything that, I'm sorry, my email's on. Let me just switch that off because that might create some annoying noise in the background. Yeah, so a governance system is just anything that tries to direct, nudge, manipulate, influence human behavior. Some of those are more negatively valenced ways of phrasing it than others. And he drew a distinction between three main types of governance system. There was a market-based governance system in which prices were the thing that nudged or influenced human behavior. So, producers and suppliers on a market are influenced by the price. They want to supply goods that are at a higher price, and people want to purchase goods at a lower price. So the price is the key variable that influences behavior there. Then he had bureaucracies in which it was legal rules or bureaucratic rules which were the main influencers and directors of human behavior. And then he had this third category of algocracy, in which it was some kind of computer system, some kind of coded architecture, to use language that has been adopted by other legal theorists like Lawrence Lessig is probably the most famous example, a book called Code, which is about how code is a kind of architecture that constrains how humans behave, or it doesn't necessarily constrain, but it sets the boundaries of what is possible for humans to do. And so Aneesh was talking about the contrasts between these three types of system, markets, bureaucracies, and algocracies, and how the global economy, in his argument, was shifting towards a kind of algocratic mode of interaction and organization. So I just adopted that terminology to talk specifically about the use of algorithms by public decision-making authorities, although in retrospect that might be a little bit too limiting, because actually a lot of the more interesting uses of algorithms in influencing human behavior are private enterprise or even personal. So I have, since I originally kind of wrote about this idea, been more open to the idea of expanding it to cover all kinds of governance systems, which is kind of returning to what Aneesh originally had in mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Actually, I really did enjoy the interview that you had with James Hughes there, and I especially, well, the part on algocracy, which is towards the end of the interview, about 51 minutes in or something, if anybody wants to look it up. Now, he did bring up the point that I feel as well. It's that the word algorithm has been around for a long time. the idea of there being a system for procedure, a procedure for formula or for solving problems or for limiting how people can operate in systems and constraining the operation of how people interact with systems has been around for a long time. And he brought up the Code of Hammurabi,
Yeah.
and used as, instead of saying eye for, he brought up eye for an eye as one of the laws back then. It was quite different. It wasn't actually eye for an eye. It depends on which class you belong to. If you took the eye
Mhm.
of a slave, you may have to pay, a bit of silver, and you had to pay more if the slave was a male and less if the slave was a female. It's quite shocking to us now. But yes, so we can imagine if these were sort of very solidly and unchangeably enforced or enshrined in law, we'd be living in a very different world today. Um, Now, I guess the main point is that perhaps we shouldn't limit algocracy to computer code. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a fair point, and it is something you need to guard against. Whenever you're picking like a label to describe some phenomenon, there are choices that go into that decision, or sorry, there are factors that influence that decision, and any label is going to be imperfect in some way. Algocracy, I latched onto just because I thought it was catchy and captured something that people are concerned about or interested in.
Oh
However,
yes. And
I
and
do
and, and
accept.
right, you are. I think that people are concerned, would be concerned in a sense if yeah they knew about what the term meant, and so that was the reason for the description, I guess. So
Yeah, like I will just, I mean, I do accept that algorithm, like the classic definition of it is just basically a well-defined kind of rule for taking some input and producing an output. And in that sense, all forms of governance are practically algocratic or have some algocratic element to them. And then
right,
certainly like the modern bureaucratic state, which is based on like collecting information about citizens, records of births, deaths, marriages, all diseases, all these kinds of things, it is heavily algocratic in that sense.
mm,
However, when I use the term, I am mainly just using it to refer to systems that are computer coded. Maybe
yeah,
like computerocracy would be a better term, but I don't
yeah,
know.
right. So no, I like the term. Now, you sort of in your paper you rested a lot of your ideas on Estlund's threat of epistocracy. And would you first, do you want to describe, well, epistocracy being, I guess, giving weight to those who are more educated and more knowledgeable um, in a democratic system. But do you want to describe, in your words, why you chose to base your paper on some of the arguments there, which were, I guess, against the idea of epistocracy?
Yeah, so as you say, epistocracy is this notion of rule by some kind of epistemic elite, which can be defined in various ways, but in Estlund's original paper and work on this, it was rule by a highly educated elite. And this is a common idea in political philosophy.
Mm,
And the two classic exemplars of it that are mentioned by Estlund are Plato, who in the Republic had this idea of a specially educated elite being the rulers of the polis or the political community, and then John Stuart Mill in the 1800s, I can't remember when he wrote that book on representative government, I think it was 1850s or something like that, where he argued that the educated classes should have more than one vote or should have greater weight in voting because of their superior knowledge or um, abilities. Now, like why do people like Mill and Plato have this idea? The way in which Estlund frames it is that it goes back to a classic paradox or problem in liberal modes of government, even though Plato wouldn't have been talking about liberal modes of government as we understand them. So liberalism is founded on the notion that people are moral equals, that no one has the right to coerce or interfere with another without some kind of legitimate grounds for doing so. But of course, the state is inherently coercive. It tries to threaten the use of force against people to get them to do things that they might not otherwise want to do. So how do you justify the state? That's one of the key questions in modern political theory or liberal political theory. And there are a range of different answers to that question. In the paper, I outlined kind of two main schools of thought. There are instrumentalists who think that the state is legitimated in having these coercive policies or procedures if doing so leads to better outcomes. So if the policies introduced by the state are better for everybody according to some kind of metric of betterness, which is very tricky to actually cash that out or flesh that out in detail, but that's the basic idea, then it's legitimate.
So
or there are
instrumentalism, in a sense.
That's instrumentalism, yeah. The policies of the state are instruments to achieving goals that are good for everybody. And if they're good at doing that, then they're legitimate. Then there's a proceduralist school of thought which says, no, it's not just about outcomes, it's also about the procedures through which we achieve those outcomes. And in certainly democratic modes of governance, which we like, or most people seem to like nowadays, they have to be participative. They have to allow people to participate in forming the policies that ultimately coerce them in various ways. Right? So they have to, the procedures have to be transparent. They have to allow for contributions by the citizens. Voting is a simple example, but contributing to some kind of deliberative panel of decision makers is also a way of participating in the process. And so, yeah, in order to be legitimate, the state has to allow for meaningful participation by citizens. That's the proceduralist school of thought. And then there are obviously people who have mixed views that contain elements of instrumentalism and proceduralism. But Estlund's idea in that paper about the threat of epistocracy was that, well, if you were a purely instrumentalist thinker, if you thought the state is justified if it's an instrument towards good ends, then there's a sense in which you might prefer or favor epistocracies, systems in which some kind of elite make all the decisions, on the grounds that you think, well, they'll be more likely to reach the correct outcome or produce the correct outcome.
Right.
Now, so when I talked about algocracy, I was using that analogy with Estlund's arguments. So he was saying we would defer to this epistemic elite. And my basic idea is that, well, if algorithms are better at achieving outcomes that are good for everybody, we might defer to algorithms in the same way. That's the initial idea. Sure. Then you need to get into the threat.
Yes. Well, first of all, let's take some analogies. I mean, humans seem to have kinds of minds which are, I guess, more epistemically apt or special or more able to be able to deal with complex knowledge than, say, a dog. But we have dogs in our households, and we call them parts of the family if they're considered pets. But we don't listen to the dog and ask them, who to vote on. But they can bark and wag their tail and run around in circles and be cute and all that in order to, persuade you to take them for a walk, or to feed them, or to do whatever they want to do, play with them or whatnot. And so can children, in a sense. They're still humans, and we still consider them as sort of moral agents to a degree. Depending on how old they are, the degree of moral agency may change.
Certainly moral agents in training, let's say, or
yes.
in development. Yeah.
Right. But in terms of an actual level of ability, it shouldn't necessarily be considered age. You see, it stands to reason that some adults should be considered moral agents in training. In fact, maybe we should all be considered moral agents in training to the degree to which we're apt and more able and more likely to make more moral decisions.
Yeah. Well, see, I think this goes back to the maybe problems with the foundational assumptions of liberalism, which, as I said, is resting on some notion of moral equality or equality more generally. And the fact is that people aren't really equal. They differ in various ways. They differ in ability, in knowledge, in understanding. There are all sorts of differences that people have. And in effect, that's what instrumentalists like, let's say, Mill, they're latching onto, though, the fact that actually we aren't equal. maybe we'd like to be equal, and maybe that is an ideal we should aim for, but the reality is that we're not. And granting that reality, there are grounds for thinking that maybe we should defer to certain kinds of human beings who
or
are,
moral agents in general.
or
We're
moral
talking
agents in
about
general.
like
Yeah.
the future here, so
Oh yeah, true. Of course. Yeah.
yes. So yeah, it is quite interesting that also IEET, who you're affiliated with, and so is James, and me to a degree as well, were involved in the project for what is it, the Rights for Non-Human Persons initiative
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, so well, that kind of gets interested into other interesting debates, but let's
Yes, we
say
don't want
some
to go
kinds of
too far
not.
down that path, but I'm just bringing that up because it is relevant that we do consider that people, agents who aren't human, who are like organic agents who are considered maybe less intelligent than humans and less able to understand systems as we do, to still
Mm.
be not just, would you consider them still like moral patients? They have certain rights.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the classic debate about, let's say, apes or well, we're apes, but let's say other primates,
Like
chimpanzees, and
greater.
so forth. Are they moral agents or are they moral patients? I think. I mean, there are different. I think the general consensus would be that a chimpanzee is certainly a being of moral concern that we should treat. We have moral duties towards it. We should be concerned about it.
Hmm. So that would
But
fall in the
maybe
category
it's
of
not a moral
patient.
agent. You know,
Yeah.
would I mean, one test for agency is like, would we blame the primate if it did something? So this story about the gorilla and who was shot dead recently in the zoo. Is it Cincinnati? I don't know if you heard this story. Um,
I'm not aware of this story. Sorry.
it happened in the past couple of days. So it's like a toddler fell into the gorilla enclosure, and the gorilla went over to grab it. It's not clear what the gorilla was going to do, but the zookeepers, I guess, shot it and killed it.
Oh.
Um, so, ignoring that outcome, there's been an outrage and concern about what happened there. But if the gorilla did do something to the child, injured the child in some way, would we blame it and deem it accountable for the behavior? I'm not sure that we would. So maybe it's not in that sense, it mightn't be a moral agent. It mightn't be a responsible moral agent anyway. But
Well,
it
in a
still should.
sense, we can still like chide our pets for like knowingly stealing food off the table, and try and I don't know, like reinforce them not to steal food off the table or to do
Yeah,
other
that's
naughty
true.
things like go to the toilet in the house or whatever.
That's true, and that's interesting because it gets into then, well, what does it actually mean to be a responsible agent? There are certain philosophers nowadays. This kind of intersects with the whole debate about free will and determinism, and whether we're actually responsible at all, whether anybody is ever responsible.
Yes.
And if that's true, then we shouldn't have this kind of blame-based or attributive model of understanding responsibility. We should just be kind of consequentialist and deterrentist in our approach. And if that's true, then there's a sense in which animals are also susceptible to that kind of mode of punishment and responsibility, because as you point out, your pet dog, you can deter or reinforce its behavior in various ways through punishment and reward. So yeah.
I don't have a pet dog, but I'm just using that as an example. I've had cats before. So yeah, all right. Now, I guess we kind of meandered a bit there. I'm sorry, that was my fault. But yeah, do you want to talk about some of the possible threats? I think that was the next logical step, was it? The possible
Yeah,
threats of algocracy?
sure. The video is suddenly breaking up quite a lot on my end. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you fine.
Okay. So yeah, the threats of epistocracy or algocracy.
I said algocracy, but you're welcome to like relate them to epistocracy, and there like it seems as though there would be some differences there. But
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you outlined some of the differences in one of your emails to me, which we could get into, but I mean, so like Estlund had this whole idea that the epistocratic elite would be some kind of stable population that you could identify over time that would have superior abilities. But a lot of people have pushed back against that. I mean, a couple of interesting points here is just that who we should defer to over time, or depending on the policy that we're interested in, that could change. Obviously, maybe we should defer to engineers when we're deciding to build a bridge, and we should defer to doctors when we're deciding whether to introduce a drug. So, who we should defer to can vary or change over time. And also, there's an interesting point in kind of decision theory or public choice theory about the fact that juries of people voting on a proposition can be more accurate than individuals voting on or with superior epistemic abilities voting on something. The Condorcet jury theorem is a very famous mathematical proof of the notion that if you have a jury of people who are at least better than chance at getting the right outcome, deferring to that jury and getting them to vote on their preferred outcome is better than relying on any one individual. And there are various expansions of that jury theorem as well, which proves that it holds even at lower thresholds of probability of them getting the correct answer. Nevertheless, like one thing.
Yes, I just wanted to bring up one thing, and there may be a difference in this epistocracy is that it's been applied to agents with knowledge, not just systems with the ability to calculate or process information into knowledge. Now, agents, especially humans, and who are sort of tied up with a lot of evolutionary psychology, hang-ups about trying to get as much resources for oneself and one's closest relatives and family members as possible. That there could be conflicts of interest in people's in humans. A human may be an expert and have the ability to, like a doctor may have the ability to direct you in the best possible way, but may choose not to do so because they're getting kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies or whatever, because they've been invited along to parties and wined and dined, and there's kickbacks when they administer or prescribe certain medicines over others. But you can't really say that about algorithms if you take the actual coders out of the equation. The algorithms say, the transparent type can be accountable, and the people who program them, there's a Chinese wall between them and any form of tantalizing kickback, right?
Yeah, so you raised, there are two interesting points there. One is just the point about human beings, that even if they are well educated and have expert knowledge in some given domain, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to make better decisions, because, as you point out, they are vulnerable to all sorts of biases or social influences that maybe we're able to account for some of them, but maybe not all of them. And that's an important point. And that raises issues then about what actually is an elite set of decision makers. Do they also have to have greater kind of moral sensitivity and be less vulnerable to these kinds of biases? That's an interesting point which we can set to the side. The other point you raised about algorithms as well, wouldn't it be better to hand over control of decision making to them, in the sense that they won't be vulnerable to those kinds of biases or social influences? At least you would hope that's true. And that's definitely an argument in favor of introducing algorithmic governance systems, because, maybe they are more transparent and fairer than human decision makers. So one of the people that I recently interviewed from my podcast was a guy called Tal Zarsky, and I've discussed a lot of his work on my blog before, and you can provide links maybe to it in show notes that you have for this. So he has an argument about implicit bias and algorithmic decision-making systems. So, one of his points is that most human decision makers nowadays, at least in democratic developed states, are not explicitly biased. They go to pains. Maybe this isn't true anymore with people like Donald Trump and other kind of far-right politicians gaining ascendancy in various countries around the world. But usually they try not to be explicitly racist or sexist in their approach to decision making. Nevertheless, they might be implicitly biased, and there's a whole psychological literature and research into implicit bias, the fact that people implicitly associate, let's say, in North America anyway, African Americans with criminality. You can do these online tests, the implicit association test.
Right, I think I've done
based on it's based on the Harvard website. Just type in implicit association test to Google, and you'll find it, and you can run a test on yourself about whether you're implicitly biased against women or against different racial groups and so forth. So the people do seem to have these implicit biases, and that can influence their decision making. And Zarsky's point is that it's very difficult to uncover those implicit biases because, again, they don't show up in the explicit reasoning of the decision makers. And one advantage over that algorithmic decision-making systems could have over human decision makers is that they'll be less vulnerable to this kind of implicit bias. And that might be an argument in favor of introducing them. He also goes further and makes what I think is quite an interesting point, because it might apply to me in writing about like the resistance to algorithmic governance or the threat of algorithmic governance. He says that part of that resistance may stem from existing human elites who are treated well by the implicit biases of human decision makers. So, well-educated, wealthy, let's say white elites in America may favor human decision makers because they know that those human decision makers will be biased in favor of them. And they may be more fearful or worried about algorithmic decision makers because they're less sure that those systems will support their existing set of advantages. So part of the resistance might stem from those existing elites. And so I find that interesting insofar as it encourages me to be self-critical and say, well, if I'm writing about problems with these systems, is that partly caused because I am one of these people who's benefited by existing human decision-making systems? Which I think is an important point.
Well, we both sort of have sort of grown up in parts of the world which have been sort of you've grown up in Ireland. I consider that's first world, at least most of
we like to think so. Yeah.
And yeah, we've been I grew up in the England ex-prison, Australia. Yeah, so
also known as Australia. Yeah. Mainly peopled by Irish criminals.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Of course,
my mum thinks I look
Aboriginal version.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So my mum thinks I look like somebody, like they call them the Black Irish. I'm not sure what that actually means. I think it's just like dark features or whatnot. But yeah, I'm sure if I did my genealogy, there'd be something down there. Look, my chin, right? It's definitely an Irish chin. Oh, I don't know what an Irish.
Some kind of sheep stealing background, anyway.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So are you from the north or the south, right? Protestant or Catholic?
South, I guess, culturally Catholic, but not practicing anymore.
Okay,
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes. All right then. So now, let's talk about what. Okay, so first of all, there's a threat of algocracy that you've outlined.
Well, actually, I haven't really outlined the threat yet.
Yes. Well, okay. So let's outline the threat. We keep on meandering. Well, let's outline what the threats might be. We've outlined motivations for sort of like not wanting algocracy, egotistical motivations, perhaps.
Yeah.
But what about the threat to the general person?
Yeah, so the general threat kind of goes back to this contrast or debate between the instrumentalist and proceduralist schools of thought about governance. Yes. All right, and so Estlund's worry about epistemic elites is that they would be less transparent and that ordinary people would be less able to participate in decision-making if we hand over or defer to epistemic elites. Yeah. And basically, like my argument is that the same could be true in the case of algorithmic governance. Or algocracy, that we defer to algorithms to make decisions for us, and the reality is that most people don't understand how algorithms work. Algorithms are becoming increasingly complex and instantiated in increasingly complex hardware and software architectures, and they might become less transparent. They might be more opaque. there might be greater opacity, to use the word that I use in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a threat to the proceduralist ethos of democratic governance. Because decisions are made that affect us, and we're less able to challenge them. We're less able to understand why they're made. We're less involved in the process of making those decisions. Like one example that I use to illustrate this, which is, I've used it a lot, and I'm always reluctant to keep using the same example over and over again, but I'll use it just now because I think it illustrates the point nicely. And it's a complicated example as well because it illustrates the way in which these systems can be opaque and problematic. It's not always stemming from the fact that it's a computer code. It's also stemming from certain decisions that humans made when designing those systems or creating those systems. So the example is the story of this guy, John Gass, who was a driver in the state of Massachusetts, who woke up one morning in 2011 to get a letter from the local registry of motor vehicles saying that his driver's license had been cancelled and that he was to cease driving on the roads immediately. So he was very surprised when he got this letter. As far as he was aware, he was a safe, law-abiding driver, or at least as law-abiding as most drivers are. Most people don't obey the rules of the road at all times, but he was pretty good. He hadn't received a ticket or a violation of any kind in the recent past anyway. So he went to the registry of motor vehicles and he asked why had his license been cancelled. They didn't tell him. They were unwilling to share that information with him. He eventually, I think, wrote a letter to the head, or he managed to get a meeting with the more senior officials within the registry of motor vehicles, and he was eventually told that what happened to him was that the registry of motor vehicles was trialing this new system, which was a facial recognition algorithm that would go through all the photographs of all the drivers on its database. A number of states in the US were using systems of the same kind. And the goal was to weed out people who were using fake identities, so potential instances of criminal fraud. And the operating principle of the algorithm was that if you found two faces in the database that were suspiciously similar to one another, you'd assume, well, that's somebody using a fake identity. We'll cancel the driver's license effective immediately. So when John Gass said, well, I'm not using a fake identity, and they told him that it was his burden to prove that he wasn't using a fake identity.
Right. So
no,
because the system was trusted so much that the person had to actually come up with the evidence to say that it is not this suspicious character that the system identified him as. There's some interesting points there, is that the part of the system that did the facial recognition probably would be opaque, but the part of the rest of the system that made decisions about like more mundane decisions, less sort of cognitive decisions, more procedure oriented perhaps, would possibly be quite transparent, especially like if there was some form of like expert system or Bayesian network, in a sense. At least you'd be able to garner what was going on. But a neural network, once it's a neural network, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on. It's not completely opaque, but it's very, very opaque.
Yeah, so like this is a well-discussed problem in the field of machine learning, that there are different systems you can implement, and some of them are more opaque than others. The terminology that's used is the interpretability problem. Okay. So can the human coders, designers, experts interpret the rules that the algorithm is using to reach its decisions? So neural networks are famously opaque, and they're the ones that are most kind of vulnerable to this interpretability problem. But there are other systems that might be less opaque.
Sure. So the other thing is you may have been going somewhere with this, and I interrupted, but I just wanted to make the point that this is one of the points that I wanted to bring up as what can we do about algocracy in order to make it better, sort of point. So yeah.
Yeah. So there are decisions that are to be made about like what kind of, let's say, machine learning system we implement, because I didn't mention this previously, but there are different kinds of algorithms, and the classic algorithm is kind of a top-down algorithm where the programmer sets out the entire rule set that the program uses, and those should be actually relatively transparent insofar as there should be a human coder that you could talk to and say, well, yeah, these are the decisions that went into that design of that system. Machine learning systems are a bit different insofar as they're programmed with some kind of learning rule.
That's right. Yeah.
And then they'd kind of generate their own rules for reaching the desired outcome. Usually they're trained on
a trained network. It's like it's difficult to understand a neural network as it might be for like some rudimentary brains out there. Understanding what a human's thinking. I mean, you have to take the black box approach. It is no other way. I mean, maybe there's been some breakthroughs in neuroscience using fMRI and magnetoencephalography that sort of can tell what kinds of things you're thinking of and things like that.
Yeah, well, you can get a sense of
at least complex.
Yeah, I mean, even those discoveries through fMRI and optogenetics and all these kind of different technologies now that allow us to see the brain in operation, they're still vulnerable to the black box problem insofar as all you're revealing there is the hardware. You don't actually, it's difficult to reveal the actual cognitive processes or networks what you're doing is you're correlating it with what the person who's performing some cognitive act is telling you and things like that. Yeah.
However, like sometimes neural nets are actually used to discover good ways to do things, and then once they're trained, once they're trained, you can model the neural networks in a white box solution, right? So you may be able to train use a Bayesian network to model the functional properties of a neural net. So there are ways around this problem. If you're trying to discover a system that would work better than humans have been able to achieve through just their brute logic or whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there are various methods of kind of reverse engineering a system, like after you've realized that it produces some kind of outcome. But I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but having spoken to programmers, they all say that there are some systems that it's just very difficult to do that for, even after the fact. But so I would. To go back to the example of John Gass, the point I wanted to make, so there's one issue here about the algorithm that's being used to actually make the decisions and whether that's opaque or not. But there's also questions then about there were other decisions that went into using it because they said, oh, well, this must be so good that we'll assume it has the right outcome and then it's up to you to prove. That's a human decision about where the burden of proof lies. And it was set up in a particular way to make it more difficult for the person who's affected by the system. And presumably we have greater control over those kinds of decisions about how the burden of proof is set up within these algorithm governance systems. Yeah. And one thing here, there's a useful framework established by somebody called Jenna Burrell. She's an academic based in Berkeley. I don't know what her background is. I think it's information systems background. So she has a paper called Understanding How the Machine Thinks, which is about opacity in machine learning. And in that paper, she distinguishes between three kinds of opacity that we might be concerned about when it comes to algorithmic governance systems. And she doesn't give them these names. These are the names that I gave them, but these are the three systems or types of opacity that she refers to. One is intentional opacity. So that just means that the human designers or people who set up the system intentionally made it opaque. Right? And there are various reasons why this happens.
Yeah.
One simple example is that exactly. So it's proprietary. It's proprietary software. They want to use it, exploit their competitive advantage, their commercial advantage. They make it opaque. Governments sometimes want to make systems opaque as well. We could get into this later, but sometimes one reason why they want to do that is they want to prevent people from gaming those systems. Right? Once you work out how the algorithm makes its decisions, what factors influence it, you can maybe manipulate or alter those factors in a way that tricks the system. One simple example is, Apple Watches. They force you to they don't force you, but they recommend that you get some activity every 15 minutes. That's one of the features on it. and you're supposed to stand up after 15 minutes and have a little walk around. But you can actually game that system just by like shaking your wrist, because it's an accelerometer within it that's recording this. So you can game that system. That's just a really trivial example, but you can imagine for more complex algorithmic systems that's a problem that could arise, and there are reasons why governments want to make the rule set or the decision-making system opaque to avoid that problem. We could get into that later on, because that also raises
right. But another point I wanted to bring up was algorithms may actually help transparency of really complex systems in a sense, such that trying to, like for instance, decision support systems could be understood, could help understand complex sets of data. Now, you mentioned reliance on big data before. We are relying on big data now, and in a sense, I find it difficult to assume when we're just going to sort of stop doing that, because it does have quite a lot of uses. In the scenario that we don't stop relying on big data, then I can imagine like people would be quite happy to use artificial intelligence or expert systems or some form of decision support systems that are in itself transparent enough such that you can rely on yourself or somebody who you can trust to inspect the algorithms underneath the hoods, and then by extension, you should be able to, to a degree, trust the data or the information that it provides, as long as you're competent enough to be able to use the tool, the decision support tool, right?
Yeah. So I mean, this links back partly to the what I was outlining previously, like to the three categories of opacity. So I mentioned intentional opacity. The second one is what I call illiterate opacity. Like one reason why these systems are opaque is just because people are illiterate about how they work, or they don't understand how computer systems work. And that's just kind of an educational problem or a knowledge gap. So once people are aware of how these systems work, they might become less opaque. But the other point you raise, which is important, is that the world is increasingly complex, and we're collecting more and more information, and that information could be very useful to us. These big data sets could be very useful to us if mined and appropriated in the right way. And there's no way that like human decision makers can do that, or human beings can do it. So yeah, like we have to rely on these systems nowadays to make effective decisions. So yeah, that's an advantage of them, of using them. But I think, again, to take advantage of them and make use of them wisely, we should be conscious of the transparency issues involved in it, and make sure that we're adopting them and using them in a transparent way. And again, those are design choices that go into these systems. Yeah.
Yes. And the other thing is, well, there must be some historical analogs. We were just talking about like the knowledge gap before. You brought it up there. Now, there's always been knowledge gaps in society. I mean, like as soon as there was a social system big enough, we needed to distribute forms of labor and distribute forms of even aspects of government needed to be distributed. It wasn't just one person at the top, like processing all the information and making all decisions. It was a distributed system of like humans using tools to help them sort of process society. There was definitely information processing going on. It just wasn't in the same like a form of computation that we are familiar with. They didn't have computers per se. They had abacuses, they had paper, they had clerics, and they had mathematicians and accountants. But they didn't have like computers, as in like the desktops and things. In fact, the term computer was first used for people.
Who just performed computations. Usually women as well.
Initially women, and also people are trying to determine trajectory of cannonballs on the field. Right?
Yeah, heavily used in military applications. It's actually quite fascinating. I think Daniel Dennett has some famous oh, it's not famous. It's famous to me because I've watched it a lot. But he has some talk where he uses a slide and there's a bunch of women at desks, and he says, "This is the first computer," and that's what they're doing, yeah, computing trajectories for various bombs and things like that for the military. Yeah, so
historical analogues, and highlighting what the differences are now. I mean, we've been able to cope in the past to the degree that we've gotten to where we are now without, dying. Is there anything better about this new computational system, or worse, in highlighting what the differences might be today compared to times when there were no computers? Complexity,
yeah,
of course, right?
yeah. So in essence, like the point here is that is it really different this time compared to what we've had in the past? Is there something new to worry about or to think about here? And first of all, I would say definitely we've had specialized systems of governance in the past where individual humans are assigned discrete tasks and they become experts in some discrete task. And actually, most people don't worry about or think about what they're doing, and they trust them to perform that role reasonably well. Although obviously there can be challenges to it. There's a famous quote by Alfred North Whitehead, he was a British philosopher, maybe he's an American, in the early 20th century. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I think it was something like civilization progresses to the point where, civilization progresses in correlation with how many decisions we have to make without thinking about them. So the idea is that the less we have to think about things, the more advanced civilization has become. So again, that's that idea that specialization breeds a greater competence and greater efficiency and greater improvements in well-being and welfare for people. That civilization is advancing as it becomes broken down into these kind of specialized nodes. Although, to be honest, there are also some interpretive issues about what Whitehead meant in that quote. And it may surprise you to learn this, but I've written about this before. So there's
You've
a
written
blog
about a lot,
post.
John.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but Nicholas Carr wrote it up in his book, The Glass Cage, which was all about the very negative, critical book about automation. And I wrote an article about his main argument, which is that automation leads to cognitive degeneration. So if you like, the Whitehead quote is that civilization advances, the fewer things we need to think about. And then there's the other contrasting view, which could be summed up in a quote from Robert Heinlein, I think, from one of the characters in his novel, which is like specialization is for ants. That it's not a real human thing. That we need to be kind of generalists and generally cognitively capable. I think that's the quote anyway from Heinlein. So Carr kind of seems to come down more on the Heinlein side of things. I don't think I'd be totally in line with Whitehead's view, but I think it's definitely true that specialization is clearly advantageous to human beings, and specialization necessarily brings with it a kind of opacity, insofar as you say, well, you deal with that, and I'll think about something else. However, there are two points I would like to raise in response to that. Although I agree that specialization is good, one thing is that when it was humans doing the specialization, it was at least in principle, or it is at least in principle, always possible to ask the humans what they're doing and try to get them to explain it to us in terms that we can hopefully understand or interpret. Will the same be true of computers? Of course, you can design computers to include that kind of facility, or you can design algorithmic governance systems to include that kind of facility where they try to explain what they're doing to people. But again, that's a choice that needs to be made in the design process. So that's something to think about. And the other point about that was something I now forget. So.
Well, you were speaking about like humans being, you were talking about instrumental and procedural before. Is that sort of down the lines what you're thinking? Because you were talking about like the procedural aspect in law, where having a human as part of the process is important.
Yeah.
regardless of the outcome. So there's got to be a balance
Oh
between.
yeah. Sorry. The other point I wanted to make is that you. Okay, so having a human involved in the bureaucratic or governance system means that you always have this in principle ability to ask them what they're doing and try to get it to explain.
Yes.
That to explain it to us. But the other point is that there may be grounds for saying, well, specialization in certain domains is a good thing. It's good that we have engineers to design our bridges and doctors to make decisions about medical care and that kind of thing. But maybe when it comes to, let's say, political systems or political governance, there's less case for specialization there, insofar as like everyone should have some kind of knowledge or understanding of how these systems work and should have some participation and involvement in these democratic institutions. Now, again, the reality is that it's really imperfect in practice, but at least in theory, you might say it's important that everyone is generally involved and concerned in those kinds of things. And you get this from politicians and policymakers on a regular basis, where they lament the lack of knowledge that people have about institutions of government and how they work. And some states force people to vote. Australia, I think, is one example of this.
Yes, that's right. Given a certain age, and I guess if you're a resident, if you're a citizen, then yes, you have to vote. Otherwise, you get fined. I mean, the fines aren't very much, but still, you get a fine.
So there's some notion. There's some notion that people should be involved in at least this kind of activity, and that so like specialization, completely handing over control of this would be a bad thing for society, because everyone should be involved and care about how they're governed, at least in this particular domain. Again, how credible that argument is, you could have a long debate about it, and how practical it is, you could have a long debate about it, but there is at least that notion out there.
Well, what side of the debate do you land on? If we can't, it's going to be a long debate, but if you can just give us like a rundown on where you sit.
Yeah, I would sit kind of in. I don't know. Suddenly, I'm talking about sitting. I need to come up with some location where I need to sit. In general, I say I'll sit in the middle, because I have to sit in the middle of most things. But I do think there are reasons to embrace some kind of involvement of the general population in political decision making. So I'm generally in favor of the notion that people should be involved in that process, and that they shouldn't defer to or be overly reliant on elites or technocrats to make those kinds of decisions for them. So I'm broadly speaking I don't want to say I'm a populist necessarily, but I'm leaning in the direction of populism when it comes to at least political governance.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know. I wouldn't go down the route of necessarily coercing people to be involved in it, or fining people. I don't know if that's a good idea or if it's an effective approach. But I do think we should encourage that involvement, and we should discourage the introduction of systems that limit the opportunity for that kind of involvement.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
and part of that goes towards like foundational assumptions that I have about like what is ultimately valuable and what makes for a good life. Okay, is a good life just simply one in which you are rewarded and it's very pleasurable and nice for you? I think that's certainly part of it, but I don't think it's everything. I think there are certain kind of virtues around agency, developing your agency capacities that are part of the good life, and we should discourage systems that limit those capacities.
So you wouldn't think it's fair if some super intelligence dragged you kicking and screaming into some like ridiculously happy utopia. If the alternative was to live out the rest of eternity in some mediocre existence, like what we have now.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. So, it would depend on what this ridiculously wonderful utopia that the superintelligence dragging me into is. But I think we discussed this in the previous interview I did with you, which is like I'm not a fan of like purely hedonistic views of well-being and what is the good life. I think there's more to the good life than that. This is an issue that I've grappled with a lot, actually, in relation to technological unemployment and happiness and meaning of life. So I have another paper on that.
Yes, yeah, and we did intend to do an interview on technological unemployment, but yeah, I had a very, very strange start of year this year. Anyway, so.
Yeah. But like the gist of the position that I've come around to there is that, well, maybe there are grounds to hand over everything to machines, and maybe there are other ways in which we can develop our agency and our cognitive capacities outside of the purely political sphere that might suffice for a kind of good life or a really rich and rewarding life. But I mean, I haven't fully developed those thoughts yet. But if people are interested, I have the paper itself, and then there's an interview I did with the guys on the Review the Future podcast. I can't remember the title of it, but I think it's episode 68 or 67 of their podcast.
I think I might have actually listened to it a while ago. Yeah, those guys are pretty good.
Where we talk about those issues.
Yeah. One other thing is that yes, look, there is some legislation in Australia where governmental procedures should be accountable, and therefore any AI system or any computational system should, in principle, be transparent and accountable. However,
we have that in the EU as well.
Yeah. That there may be ways or loopholes or workarounds that people can actually use to get around the headache, or not make their systems accountable or transparent. Have you got any sort of examples of how that might take shape or what that might look like?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the EU example. I have it in my paper.
You mentioned it in another podcast.
So in the EU, any system that affects a person has to be reviewable by them, okay, so I have it here. There's a data protection directive from mid-90s, and it states that every person shall not be subject to a decision which produces legal effects concerning him or significantly affects him, which is based solely on an automated processing of data intended to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to him, such as his performance at work, creditworthiness, reliability, and conduct, and so forth. So you're not allowed to be subject to a solely automated process. There has to be some human decision maker that you can speak to or behind that system. However, there are workarounds into it. So there are two main ones, is that people are entitled to voluntarily contract themselves out of that right. So if you consent to the use of a governance system that is purely automated, you're not bound by that right anymore.
Yeah, okay. Like in one of those huge sort of terms of agreement things that we tick off every day without reading.
Possibly, yeah. they probably are there. Who knows? I'm not an expert in the law of this. I know people who are. I should probably ask them. But the other thing as well is that as long as the government takes other steps to ensure that the individual's legitimate interests are protected, or the authority takes steps to ensure that the legitimate interests are protected, they can avoid this requirement as well. So there are those kind of loopholes or workarounds. There is, at least in principle, that notion that you can't have a solely automated system within the European Union.
That's interesting.
I don't know what it is in Australia. Possibly it's something broadly similar.
So in a sense, even like that could be something that you could put up as like a way to avoid some of the threats or the dangers of an algocracy, even to the extent that there is one now. The danger of people accidentally signing away their right to review a system which records information about them, particularly about their performance in the workplace or whatnot, medical.
This is that's the favored kind of solution to the threat of algocracy by many lawyers and legal academics, that we insist upon a legal right to review these systems. Oftentimes they also argue for some kind of regulator. Lawyers love arguing for new regulatory authorities or new regulatory bodies to solve problems, but a regulator that reviews algorithms that are used in governance to ensure that they're transparent and to ensure that they're protecting the interests of people. But I mean, I definitely think that would help.
Yeah.
But I think that has to be balanced against the fact that these systems are becoming more integrated into daily life and more complex over time. So it might become more and more difficult to ensure that right. And we also, this is an important point, and one thing that a point I make in the paper itself is that there's a trade-off here in that insisting upon that kind of reviewability and transparency means that the systems might actually be less efficient and less good at securing the outcomes that we want. And we have to acknowledge that trade-off. And where do we want to come down, if you like? Do we want to have a less efficient system that is more transparent, or do we want to go for the more efficient system? Efficient here, I just mean better at achieving desired outcomes.
Sure. In as much as they're predictable. I think the difference is it may be difficult to predict the kinds of society we might live on once we give up our right to be in a position of decision making or affecting decision making, and
yeah.
it might be if we do end up in a society where we don't really have these rights, or it's not really practical for us to be involved in decision making, it may be very hard to escape. Oh no.